Bone is the last variety of connective tissue that we will visualize and talk about, and it's of course a very important variety of connective tissue. It has multiple functions, the first of which is to provide attachment sites for muscles. It gives our body structure and allows us to have muscles that will produce movement. Bone is also a protective tissue. If you think of your skull or the vertebra of your spine, they protect the nervous system. Also, we can look at the rib cage and see that it forms this protective shield for the internal organs or viscera, like the heart and the lungs. So it has lots of important functions. Another important function of bone is that it stores calcium. It acts as a calcium reservoir. So if we need calcium, we can go to the bone and we can reabsorb it, or sometimes we shorten that word and call it resorb. So there are hormones that we talk about later in this class that will cause the resorption of bone, and that's a reservoir for calcium. So if we need calcium, where do we go? We go to the bone to get it. Okay, now as we look at bone under the microscope, especially the dense variety of osseous tissue or compact bone, we will see a structure that looks like this. It looks like bullseyes next to one another. And so we're going to describe some of the structure of this bullseye. In fact, if we were to look at one of these, we would call this, all by itself, we would call that an osteon. Another name for that is a Haversian system. Okay? Now, at the center, we find this opening right here. In fact, this is kind of an open space. And we find blood vessels. Here's an artery. We'll go in blue for a vein. And then let's actually put a nerve in there too. In green, there's a nerve. And that's an open space. In fact, what we call that, we have a name for that. It's called, let me put an arrow here. It's called the Haversian canal. Now, around that Haversian canal, we see these rings, and those rings are made up of hard matrix, and it's actually what we would call ground substance that's making up that matrix, and it's basically calcium phosphate, and so it's the calcium that makes that matrix really hard and gives bone lots of its important structural properties. And the orientation of these layers around the Haversian canal is important for adding strength to bone as well. Now we call each one of these rings, we call them concentric, like concentric rings, rings inside of rings inside of rings. We call those concentric lamellae. Lamellae is plural. So concentric lamellae, L-A-M-E-L-L-A-E, lamellae. Singular, we would just drop the E. It would be a lamella. Okay, so those are the rings. Now, sandwiched in between those rings, let me maybe go back to a different color that we haven't used. Let's use gray. Let's see how well that shows up. I don't like that. Let's use purple. Sandwiched in between those rings, we have these little pockets. Do you remember when we talked about hyaline cartilage and we had those little soap bubbly like pockets? We have the same sort of a structure in bone. In fact, that little pocket or space is called a lacuna. And if we were to make them plural, if we were to talk about several lacuna, individual lacuna, we would call them lacunae. So we could add the E. That would be plural. So we'll draw arrows to 2 of them there, so it's appropriate. Now, inside the lacuna, or inside one lacuna, we have the cells. And inside, we would say inside the lacuna is an osteocyte, which is a bone cell. Remember when we had a cartilage cell, we called it a chondrocyte. So chondrocytes live within a lacuna, and osteocytes live within lacunae. Okay? And so this is the basic structure of the osteon or Haversian system, and you need to know all of these parts. Now, there are these little, you see these little, like, they look like little tiny fissures in my drawing. Those are called canaliculi. Think of a canal. Those canaliculi are little openings, and those allow blood and nutrients to move in between those hard rings or concentric lamellae and get out to the osteocytes. So those are canaliculi. Let's take a look at bone underneath the microscope. Okay, here we are, and we can look at now a cross-section of compact bone, and I hope you think that my drawing did a little bit of justice to this structure. So if we look right here, this is one osteon or Haversian system. Here we have the Haversian canal at the center, and you can imagine a blood vessel and or blood vessels, arteries and veins, as well as nerves in this region. Now, you see these little dark structures there? Those are the lacuna, or lacunae, I should say, and we can imagine osteocytes within them. Okay? Now, admittedly, we don't really see a great structure of an osteocyte, but I do want you to know what is there. That is a lacuna, and an osteocyte would be anticipated to be residing within a lacuna. Now, these rings, can you see rings upon rings upon rings? Those are the concentric lamellae. And these little tiny cracks or fissures that we see emanating from or kind of through the concentric lamellae perpendicular to its orientation, we find those are the canaliculi. And so this is what we would find as the slide really characteristic of compact bone. And so if you labeled this bone, or you could label it as osseous tissue, that would be just fine. And I hope that you think that you should be fairly confident with being able to identify bone after this image. Okay, we are going to pick up next with nervous tissue and then finish with muscle tissue.